Wow, man, we haven't done this in a very long time. This is for those of you who used to listen to us a year ago, welcome back. To those of you who haven't, we're the soupy, the soupy whisker bros.
We're extremely soupy.
But we're actually the super whiskey bros. I am Sean, and that is Tyler, and we are legitimate brothers, and we're
Which
super,
is
and we're made of
unfortunate.
whiskey.
All those things seem legitimate.
Mhm. Speaking of whiskey, Tyler, what are you drinking?
I actually got a little bit of Old Hammer,
Ah,
um,
I don't know it, but it
because
sounds beautiful.
it's it's not as good as I wanted it to be. It's aggressively hmm, I hate pretending like I know how to talk about this. Um, it's too sweet.
Hmm.
It's I always want to say malty because that's what beer is when it's too sweet, but this is just too sweet.
Ah, yes, sweet.
Remember how much I hated Monkey Shoulder? It's like a
Yeah.
better version of how I hate Monkey Shoulder.
Okay, so if you don't like sweet, you need to check out some ryes. Maybe rye is uh it's spicy. It's very
You
good.
like spice. I like it when it hurts me. When it hurts
Mhm.
me in the mouth.
So I'm trying something that I haven't tried. Well, I say I haven't tried before. I tried it yeah, yesterday or Thursday night one, I don't remember. But this was my first bottle of it ever. It's a 1792 small batch, and it's really good. It's I don't want to say sweet, right? Because like it's not particularly sweet for a bourbon, but it has
You also
that
don't want
bourbon.
to say that because it's boring when people talk about whiskey being sweet like I just did.
Yeah, exactly. I don't like to do the boring things that you do. Um, uh, no, like it's not like particularly sweet for a bourbon. It has the classic bourbon sweetness. And there's something that you'd think I would hate because I don't like these things much as probably as much as you do, and definitely as much as most people do. But every time I drink it, the thought pops up in my mind of those like what are they called, like butter cookies or whatever, the a
Mhm.
billion
Yeah.
cookies in a tin
Yeah, yeah.
with Santa Claus on it that every
Those
grandmother has.
yeah, aren't those are terrible though.
Mhm. Yeah, I know. Like I don't like them, but like my mind goes to that place, and it's a comforting place.
That's fair.
Mm,
Comforted by all the grandmothers out there. Thanks,
mhm.
Grandma. This whiskey's for you.
All I know is I was always disappointed when I opened up one of those tins and it had those cookies in it because I was always expecting it to have caramel corn in it.
Well, not as
I'm sorry,
disappointed
not
as
caramel corn the candy, caramel popcorn. Oh,
ugh. Well, not as disappointed as both of our grandmothers would be if they knew we
mm,
were sitting here talking about whiskey and tobacco.
yes.
So there is that.
Oh, you know.
Speaking of tobacco,
Speaking
did
of
you end up
tobacco,
grabbing a pipe?
yes, I did. I did.
So in a turn of events, I actually normally, as you know, I
Mm-hmm.
normally smoke out of the pipe that you made me.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
But I usually leave that at work because I'm there the most. So I've actually gotten the very first pipe. I think you gave this to me too because you got me started with most of it. It's with that corn, one of those cheap corn cob pipes.
Mm-hmm.
And I was going to smoke some old Toby that I got at the Renaissance Festival, but when I
Long
opened up
bottom
my
leaf.
bag, no, thank you. No, wait a minute. I got both.
Mm.
I got both.
I was
Um,
gonna say, unless she started recently, she didn't have an old Toby blend. I made an old Toby blend, and I thought I gave you some, but I
well,
didn't
that's
think
what I
she
was
had
about
that.
to. That's what I was getting to there. When I opened up
Ah.
my smoking bag, I found a bag of Sean's old Toby.
It's too bad you don't have any more because this would be technically it would be even better than the old Toby that I made. And I don't have any with me because all my real stuff is in a storage building. But
Mhm.
it's too bad you don't have the capstan navy.
I do.
Oh, you still have because that would be. That would be technically even better, for a
Well,
thing right
10
now.
so here's the thing, I figured, in homage, if I do
Mhm,
half a bowl of Old Toby and half a
mhm.
bowl of the Capstan, considering the
Mm,
2 t that we're 2 focusing on
yeah,
2 people the most here, seemed
mhm,
appropriate to me.
yeah. Now, I don't have any of my stuff, so I have to have the stuff that I bought most recently. So I don't have any of my mixes or any of the cool, blends or anything. So I right now I'm, smoking Cup of Joe's Sutliff English Blend number 502.
Oh, number 5 is how was the 501?
Hmm, not sure, my only order from Cup of Joe's.
Ah,
Yeah. But,
so me saying that about the 2 blends was kind of a segue, if you will, and you will,
I do.
into the topic at hand for this morning.
Into the topic at hand, yes, so there are the topic at hand today, and this is a topic that we will pop onto several times in the future, I'm sure. But the topic today revolves around one Professor John Ronald Reuel Tolkien. Uh, he
N Not one of them, the.
yes, yes, the very particular, the famous one uh, of the Great Britain Tolkien's. Um,
Uh-huh.
specifically, the topics of the Tolkien Society Summer Seminar of this year, and an article, an old article, a 2003 article by Johan Hari, titled "The Wrong Lord of the Reeds." One is about how Lord of the Rings bad, and the other about is well, we'll get to that later. The Wrong Lord of the Reeds, the article is what we're going over first, and we'll get to that seminar when we get to it. Anyways, do you have the article open in front of you?
I do.
Okay, so I'm sure the people at home do not. On YouTube, I'll have pictures of what we're talking about on here, but if you're on the podcast, you can't see pictures very well. I will link the articles and the links like in the show notes. I'll all the links that we're or all the things that we're talking about today. I'll link in the show notes, but for so you can go along. I'm going to read each segment before we talk about it. I think that's fair. So
Yeah,
here's
yeah.
how the article starts off. The first paragraph reads thusly: When Waterstones named Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings as the best novel of the 20th century, Germaine Greer offered a lament. Ever since I arrived at Cambridge as a student in 1964 and encountered a tribe of fully grown women wearing puffed sleeves, clutching teddies, and babbling excitedly about the doings of hobbits, she said, it has been my nightmare that Tolkien would turn out to be the most influential writer of the 20th century. The bad dream has been realized. So that is. Oh, I'm gonna read the next sentence on there, so we can give this person's opinion of Germaine
Greer.
Greer, of this man's opinion of what she said. The very first sentence, of the next paragraph says, "And we haven't woken up yet." Now, I have something to say about this paragraph. Because this is just me. I wanted to see, like, I wanted to see, where this guy is coming from, right? Because at first this is going to seem like it could be an ad hominem argument both against him and against Jermaine Greer, but it's not, right? I'm not attacking this man and I'm not attacking this woman, either one. Um, uh, but I do have something to say about that because if you can see, like, where a person's coming from, you can get an idea of, like, or you have an idea of who this person is as a person. Then you have an idea, like, like, oh, you think this, you believe this way, then we have no middle ground here. Like, I can attack your argument, but there's nowhere where you can say, okay, I agree with you here, but let's do this, and you can figure out whether you can ever have that middle ground by seeing what a person, where a person stands, right?
This
Um,
is the
uh,
way.
yeah. And so I'm going to give you, so my first thing is just thinking about this from a writing perspective, right? This guy, um, like, you'd think that he wouldn't just quote it and then say, and I agree with that statement. Like if he thought Jermaine Greer was a bad person, he would have said something like, "And while I don't like Jermaine Greer, I sure agree with this sentiment." You know, like you'd put that in there because you expect if you're going to quote someone, unless you're using them as a bad example, you think of this person as good. You're on the same side as this person for the most part, right? I mean, like, it wouldn't make a whole lot of sense for me to say, I guess no, like here's how I would quote this, right? If I said anyone can deal with victory, only the mighty can bear defeat. Now, I don't like Adolf Hitler, but that was a cool thing that he said. That's how I would say it, right? You
I
know,
would hope so.
so you can know that, hey, yeah, Adolf Hitler said that. Like that is a pretty. I mean, you got to admit that's a pretty cool quote. Anyone can deal
Yeah.
with victory, only the mighty can bear defeat. That sounds cool, but obviously, I have to add this in real fast because I'm not just going to say, I believe it was Hitler who said, you know, right? And so you have to put that in there, and so I am, uh, and so and so for that reason, I have to assume that this man thinks Jermaine Greer is a good person,
Right.
right? Okay, so now let me talk about Jermaine Greer for a minute. So now we can know who this man associates with. So we can so I can show you this man is not coming from a good place. Jermaine Greer, she was lifted up and exalted as one of the primary voices of the radical feminist movement in the 60s and 70s. Um,
Wonderful.
uh, and then she said before that she doesn't. I'm not going to talk about what the movement believes. I did write that down, but that doesn't, because she said before that she doesn't agree with most of what the movement says, and she actually doesn't like women. Take that however you mean that to mean. But
Mm.
I'm going to give you some of the stuff that she said here. Let me now this is a fairly well a direct copy from like stuff that like her biographers and a few people that wrote about her. So this is, from what I can tell, people on her side said these things about her. In 1969, she created a porn magazine called Suck. In one issue, I believe it was issue 7, printed in, well, she started in 1969. Issue 7 was probably in 1969, 1970. This is a direct quote. It had an image of a man holding a screaming woman with her legs in the air while another rapes her anally. This
Um,
was her idea. One of Greer's biographers, named Elizabeth Kleinhans, wrote that, quote, almost nothing was off limits for Suck, including descriptions of child abuse, incest, and bestiality.
okay.
In 2003, Greer wrote a book called The Boy. Greer herself described this book as an attempt to address the modern woman's apparent indifference to the teenage boy as a sexual object and to, quote, advance women's reclamation of their capacity for and right to visual pleasure.
Hmm.
Oh, she also wrote that the animal world had, quote, finally taken its revenge when Steve Irwin died.
Yeah, see, I could almost get like we're like, well, different people have their different. No, that's too far.
And so
Um,
this is the chick that this man is wanting to associate himself with.
yeah, I'm good. I don't need any Stingray apologists.
Yeah.
Incredible.
Hashtag Stingray did nothing wrong.
Hashtag Stingray. So that really sets the tone for how ridiculously
Mhm.
what's the word I'm looking for? There's this very postmodernist,
Stupid.
yeah, stupid postmodernist
Mhm.
neo-Marxist approach to this article.
Uh-huh. Funny you should mention
Like
that.
the
That word
things
Marxist is gonna come up again.
we're off to a great start.
Okay. Yeah. If you do you have anything else about Jermaine Greer, or
Oh
do you think
no,
I've
no,
I've
no.
bashed her enough?
All I, all I care about is that she hated Steve Irwin.
Yeah. She hated Steve Irwin and women. And really, those are the two things I care the most about in life.
This is this is true.
Yeah. Okay. So going back to Yoan here. The BBC's Big Read competition to find Britain's favorite book reached its climax this weekend, and Tolkien is odds-on favorite to win. Now, that's not this weekend. This article was written in 2003. The
It still
success,
deserved it this year too.
oh yeah, it deserves it every year, absolutely. Um, uh, that does make me think. I didn't know when I wanted to put this in, but I am going to put this in now. When you said it deserves it this year too, this is a very interesting take from an author who is like I think you agree with me that J.R. Tolkien is the best fantasy writer of the 20th century.
Yeah, yeah,
Okay.
I'd hold it for that.
Yeah, and I mean, you and I, there's argument's sake that you and I both might fight for it. He's the greatest fantasy author of all time, but definitely of the 20th century.
Without
Um,
question.
uh, yeah, in my opinion, the best or my favorite author of the fantasy author of the 21st century is Brent Weeks, and he made a statement about Tolkien, um, uh, and it was very interesting. What you mentioning that he deserves to win, this year as well, and I agree with that statement. But it's interesting what Brent Weeks said. He said there is. I'm not going to quote him exactly because I don't remember the exact quote, but he said, the ending to the Lord of the Rings shows a lot about Tolkien's writing style. Um, uh, it said because like the ending, he started with a very big ending. Um, uh, here we go. He said, I guess I need to say this before I talk about the ending. He said, Tolkien is the rock on whom fantasy authors anchor. Um, uh, but as of right now, Brandon Sanderson, and in recent years, is kind of taking Tolkien's place as the person on whom people like to say, who am I going to reference in this book? The number one is Tolkien, but Brandon Sanderson is kind of starting to take his place as that in that position. And he said the reasons for that seems to be is that what the modern reader wants to read and how they want to read is starting to shift. He said, and he gave the example of endings. He said Brandon Sanderson's endings are always, he has these big endings, but they're over quickly. Said, and The Lord of the Rings said it starts off with a big ending, but then the ending continues, and as the ending gets longer, it gets smaller. And so like it starts off like like Brandon Sanderson says, "Here's the fate of the world," and that's the fate of the world. Here's what happened to our heroes. Tolkien said, "Here's the fate of the world," and now here's the fate of the West, and now here's the fate of the Shire, and now here's the fate of Bag End, and now here's the fate of Frodo, and he does that over 70 pages. And I do think that because I really liked the ending of Lord of the Rings, and I think anyone who loves the story does also. But that is an interesting point, you know. That it does make sense that what people the way people want to read will change, especially in today's age of instant gratification. A Brandon Sanderson ending that's over in 10 pages will be more satisfying to a person like that than an ending that takes 50 pages. But that's not this guy though. This guy thinks it's actively bad. Not and because I think that's a legitimate argument to say, hey, here's something that I don't like about Lord of the Rings, and that's something that we could talk about. This guy though, this guy though.
You see, and you and I have outside of this had this conversation
Mhm.
probably a couple times. This is not to get off the subject like we're currently doing,
Yeah, absolutely.
but
Mhm.
this is the, why we like Christopher Paolini so much.
Mhm.
He does kind of the same thing. You think about the ending to the inheritance cycle.
Uh-huh.
Um, I mean, it's every bit of 70 pages long,
Yeah.
um,
Yeah, but
without
that
too much question.
the difference though between the ending to the Lord of the Rings and the ending to Inheritance is that the ending to Inheritance kind of sucked.
Well, there is that, but I mean, it's still like really shut it down. I mean, you think about
Mhm.
I always kind of compare how people structure their stories. I always want to hold it up next to an example of Joseph Campbell, Hero's
Mhm.
Journey,
Mhm.
um, because you've always got this that wheel to kind of always go around, if you will. There's a more advanced version. If you've ever seen the hero's journey wheel, it kind of just like shows the basic points of the story, and part of it exists in the normal world, and part of it exists in the special world, and all that kind of stuff. But then there's a very particular version of the hero's journey that changes or that allows for
Mhm.
what Joseph Campbell kind of called like more complex endings, and essentially means it runs you through that a few steps of the ending cycle more than once. And the reason for that is to show total resolution on more than one plane if the author has decided to write about more than one plane, which is very much Tolkien, because you think
Mhm.
about, like you just said, like, okay, so now we have like Sauron's defeated. Okay, well now we have to go, Aragorn has to go become king of Gondor, and we have to do all this. Okay, well now we have to go see the Rohirrim go back home. Okay, the Rohirrim go back home. Okay, that's good. Oh, okay, well now we have to make sure that as we're traveling all back through in this funeral procession, we have to see if Saruman's still at Isengard. Oh, well the inns are fine, so the inns have wrapped up their ending. Okay, well let's keep going down here, and then you have like, okay, well then now Gimli, and you keep going, you keep going, you keep going, and then you actually have a whole nother ending in the Shire.
Yeah. Mhm.
And then you still have more stuff after that. So I mean, like then you get to wrap up the world with people traveling west. I mean, it makes him. It's what makes him the greatest author is the ending. I mean, the whole book's
Mhm.
great, but the ending is what really makes him like the author.
Yeah, absolutely. It's actually going. I'll go back to something else that Brent Weeks said because he was talking about what makes a good ending. Um, uh, and he said, "What makes a good ending is fulfilling the promises you made previously as an author."
Yep.
He said, you and because he was talking about his book, he was right. He said, "I would like to end my book this way," and then he went back to one of his older books and said, "No, I already said this was going to happen, so I have to change my ending." But and he said the reason why it's so hard to end is it's so hard to end a fantasy novel is because fantasy authors they don't really like beginnings too much because it's hard to begin a fantasy novel, and they don't really like endings too much because it's hard to end a fantasy novel. But they love middles, and you write a middle, and you write another middle, and you write another middle, and just keep stacking up these middles, and somehow your ending has to tie these all together. And yeah, Tolkien did that beautifully, and I think Brent Weeks does it well too, which is why I like to reference him. So I must apologize to everyone in the podcast now. Um, uh, I'm in the only room in which my child has available to play, so he will be playing in the background.
I'll probably have my child in here eventually as well.
Mm. Um, uh, but yeah, it's one of the hazards of being a dad. The success of his dire trilogy obviously cannot be attributed to literary merit. The great critic Edmund Wilson called it balderdash and juvenile trash when it was first published, and it's hard to disagree. Yeah. Edmund Wilson was referred to as the great critic. And I don't know if I'd call him the great critic. Let's I'm not going to read the entire review because it's long, but I'm gonna read I'm gonna read this part of his thing right now. Which also, by the way, let's talk about where Edmund Wilson is coming from. Right, he was also an author. Most of his books primarily featured Freudian and Marxist themes. So there you
Okay.
have it. So now you know where Edmund Wilson's coming from as a his point of view that he'll be reviewing books from. Freudian and Marxist. Neither of those sound like someone who would agree with anything Tolkien had to say. But yeah, this is the only excerpt from his review that I'm going to read because it's really the only one that really makes a difference. Except when he is being pedantic and also boring the adult except when he is being pedantic and also boring the adult reader, there is little in the Lord of the Rings over the head of a 7-year-old child. Certainly it has no allegorical intentions, general, political or topical, moral, religious or political, or particular or topical, moral, religious or topical. An overgrown fairy story, a philological curiosity, that is then what Lord of the Rings really is. The pretentiousness is all on the part of Dr. Tolkien's infatuated admirers, and it is these pretensions that I would here assail. Well,
It
um,
doesn't make
uh,
me happy.
yeah, he's someone who wrote about that article referred to it as the ultimate killjoy review.
I'm with that.
Yeah, Yeah. Now, on the point of so except when he's being pedantic and also boring the adult reader, I mean, like I love his pedantism. Like, yes, Tolkien was a pedant, and I love it. Like it shows, like it really shows in the world. And I'm gonna go over that in a second because I have more on the article to read about the point of him being pedantic. Um, uh, but also in the part that said, it said there's little in the Lord of the Rings over the head of a 7-year-old child. Yeah, I actually agree with that statement, but I don't view it as a bad thing, right? Like I could read this book to my child when he's 4, 5, 6 years old. I could read this book to him, and he could, for the most part, understand everything that was going on in it, and he would love the adventure, and I would love reading it to him because I love the adventure because it's a fantastic story, but written so simply that yes, even a child could get it, and that is beautiful. It takes an extremely good author to be able to do that, to write a good story that you can enjoy as an adult, and also you would love as a 7-year-old child. I'm going to give a review for The Hobbit from from C.S. Lewis. Um, uh, and this is for the Hobbit, but it applies to Lord of the Rings too. He said in his review, he said it must be understood that this is a children's book only in the sense that the first of many readings can be undertaken in the nursery. Alice is read gravely by children and with laughter by grown-ups. The Hobbit, on the other hand, will be funnier to its youngest readers, and only years later, at a 10th or 20th reading, will they begin to realize what deft scholarship and profound reflection have gone into making everything in it so ripe, so friendly, and in its own way so true.
Pretty much spot on.
Yeah, well, obviously, C.S. Lewis said everything he said was spot
Well,
on.
this is the truth.
Yeah, C.S. Lewis is the only other contender for most intelligent writer of the 20th century.
Mm,
But
for my 2 cents, sure.
yeah, um, and yeah, so another thing that he mentioned, and this shows where he's coming from, is that certainly has no allegorical intentions, including religious allegorical intentions. Um, uh, I'm going to make a statement by Tolkien himself, and then something else by Brent Weeks, because man, Brent Weeks has a lot to say about the Lord of the Rings, and it's all good. Um, uh, but
Well,
yeah,
obviously.
yeah. So here's what Tolkien. Yeah, Brent Weeks is a fantastic epic fantasy author, so of course he's going to love Lord of the Rings. Here's what Tolkien said about creating a myth, which is what he did with Lord of the Rings. He said, "We have come from God, and inevitably the myths woven by us, though they contain error, will also reflect a splintered fragment of the true light, the eternal truth that is with God. Indeed, only by myth making, only by becoming sub creator and inventing stories, can man aspire to the state of perfection that he knew before the fall." Makes it sound like he writes myths, that all myths that he writes are a form of allegory. That's what that
It would
sounds like to
appear that
me.
way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then uh, Brent Weeks said if Tolkien didn't invent the eucatastrophe, he at least coined it. He said, and Tolkien's insistence upon the eucatastrophe at all times, as opposed to the discatastrophe, Tolkien's insistence upon using a eucatastrophe in all of his stories. He said that almost certainly has to stem from his beliefs and viewpoint as a Christian man. And like if this guy, Brent Weeks is definitely not a Christian man himself, but he noticed that Christianity was influencing what Tolkien was writing. So how can you possibly say, how can anyone be so stupid as to say there are obviously no allegorical intentions, right?
You see, and that right there, and then I'll make this a very quick point because it's very off topic. This is
Mhm,
how you can tell that there is an intelligent commentary happening here from him, as opposed to this article written by the individual we're reading. If one of my favorite, whether you want to call it a debate or a discussion, doesn't really matter, is
mhm,
between Dr. Jordan Peterson and
mhm,
Sam Harris.
mhm,
So people who have two ideologically very different viewpoints when it comes to, so for instance, this conversation was about the moral of ethics and the moral of shall we say, um, the real essence and beginning of right and wrong. And of course, Sam Harris is debating against the concept of it being religiously influenced, and that religion um, shouldn't be considered as the basis. And you have two people arguing against each other, but two people who have the utmost respect for each other's opinion because they realize, wow, I'm talking to an extremely intelligent person, and they behave as such. And
Hmm.
then you have what you just read is the same way,
Yeah.
but then you have this article.
Yes, and that's the problem though. Like I will say this, his review doesn't really show it, other than his wording and the way he speaks. Edmund Wilson seems like a very, very smart man, but
You
he
cut
also
out.
seems, I said, Edmund Wilson seems like a very, very smart man, but also he lets his strange, like I said, Freudian and Marxist ideologies get in the way of his intelligence when he's speaking. It seems. Um. And he's also, from something that he wrote, he's also kind of a prick. But and maybe that's what it is. He's just a constant downer. Maybe that's what it is. He just can't be happy. But I'm one of the, like, I don't, this wasn't talking about Edmund Wilson specifically or anything that he said, but I'm reading this, and I like to think of Romans 1:22 when reading any of Edmund Wilson's works. The professing themselves to be wise, they became fools. So the next thing that's said, and it goes back to Tolkien being pedantic, which I like, um, is the next sentence of the article. It says Tolkien's obsessional describing of a fictional landscape borders on the autistic, as does the almost total absence of women or sophisticated emotion from his work. Okay, so that we got that cut down into, we got it into two parts. Um, uh, the first thing is the Tolkien's obsessional describing of a fictional landscape borders on the autistic, which is obviously a good thing.
Yeah, by
Um,
far.
um, yeah, let's see. Let's get this quote here. A quote here from W.H. Alden. No previous writer has created an imaginary world, an imaginary world, and a feigned history as in such detail. By the time the reader has finished the trilogy, including the appendices to this last volume, he knows as much about Tolkien's Middle-earth, its landscape, its fauna and flora, its peoples, their languages, their history, their cultural habits as, outside his special field, he knows about the actual world. It is a world of intelligible law, not mere wish. The reader's sense of the credible is never violated.
Yeah, I mean it's pretty much perfect. I mean it's one of the very, very, very few perfect fictional worlds.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there have been a few others, but none that were created by one man.
Yeah,
Um,
no,
uh,
it's pretty incredible, and also the almost complete absence of women is borderline funny.
yeah, um, uh, yeah, yeah. I made a note referencing the complete absence of women. Where did I put that here? Here we go. Yeah, complete absence of women, and and also this sophisticated emotion. There's no such thing as sophisticated emotion, right? There's emotion, and that's it. You know, like if you see emotion, you can tell someone is feeling something. That's that. Like what's a sophisticated emotion? Like, oh, I I'm very angry right now, but I'm looking at you and smiling because I'm a hoe.
Yeah,
Is that a
it's
sophisticated emotion because you appear to not be feeling what you're feeling? If
well,
so,
I
that's
think
retarded.
I think there's someone. I think there's somewhere later in this article where they actually reference. Well, I wish people would start reading Tolstoy. Really?
Mm-hmm.
Like that kind of that reflects all of that to me because they're just saying like of all the things you're going to compare it to. So you're taking like the greatest literary fiction of all time, arguably,
Mm-hmm.
that is recognized as such, and that's what saying the sophisticated emotion is just trying to appeal to someone else to try to this person's trying to pretend to be smarter. So like, oh, if you really cared about literature, you just read Tolstoy. And go, oh, you
Mm-hmm.
suck. You
Yeah.
just suck. I can tell from reading that sentence. I hate you. I know I do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And now, like, if coming from about any other person, The way the person, the way Tolstoy's mentioned before, I would have said they were just throwing out random 20th century authors, to say, well, you read this guy, this guy, this guy, this guy, because he did say anyone but Tolkien. And so I would, coming from anyone else, I would say that was just the person's attempt to just name another 20th century author. But the pretense behind everything that this imbecile is saying, I agree with you. I agree with you on that.
Yeah, they
Now,
said Tolstoy on purpose.
yeah,
That was like they
mhm,
started writing this article. They're like, I gotta say Tolstoy.
yeah. um, uh, but yeah, they referring to the total absence of women. So there are two things on that. The first one is, this the, the the first one is the apparent lack of women for the most part throughout the adventure itself. Um, uh, like it's established that this. Oh, like it's not really established because it didn't say in the book. Oh, by the way, this is this takes place in a uh, Anglo-Saxon pre-Anglican old school Europe is when this is based on. It doesn't say that, but you can tell that's what it's based on. And
Hmm.
there's something very interesting about because that's the time period that Professor Tolkien studied. There's something very interesting about that, and that was it wasn't typically common for women to go on adventures in those days. Like it's accurate to the what he's writing about, that there wouldn't be several women. And oh yeah, let's also forget that there's one particular bad guy who's, like, of all the people who can be truly physically defeated, the most powerful of all those people. And let's not forget that person was killed by a woman.
Yeah, exactly. So I mean, that's the point I was just about to make. You have
Yeah.
who is arguably the second in command bad guy,
Hmm.
and that's who was killed by a woman. So I mean,
Hmm.
like, really? That's who you're gonna point to that as being one of your, like, oh, this is one of my big critiques of this paper. Like, then you didn't read the book.
Yeah. Um. And that and we're also going to talk about Eowyn and Durnhelm again later, during another time. But I don't know. I like is everything this person says, like, comes from just such a disingenuous standpoint.
Oh
Like,
yeah. Well, this is someone who just wants to masquerade as an intellect.
mhm, yeah, it's stupid. Now, now for the sentence. Are you ready for this sentence?
This is gonna kill me. Is it the racist one?
No, The Lord of the Rings isn't loved because it's a good novel, but because it taps into some of the most atavistic and ugly impulses of our times. So I'm not going to make comment about that sentence in particular because he goes on to explain what he means, and I'm going to go get his explanation. Um, uh, so I'm going to read this entire paragraph because the first sentence is the most obvious is racism, and then he explains what he means by that. So I'll listen to his entire explanation with its context before I say anything. That's fair. He wouldn't give me that, but I'll give him that.
Yeah, exactly.
The most obvious is racism. The purely evil orcs are, in Tolkien's words, squat, flat-nosed, sallow-skinned, with wide mouths and slant eyes. The enemy is the Dark Lord, and he lives in the Black Land. The heroic hobbits and elves are, by contrast, uber-Aryan and ethnically pure. Ideals of blood and its purity are always sloshing around his narrative. For example, the men of Gondor, the High Men, are descendants of the Númenóreans, the greatest of all warriors. Over the centuries, they have become degraded because of breeding with inferior races. When their bloodline is pure, as in Aragorn's descendants, the strength of the original Lords of the West is retained. Okay, so starting off with, the purely evil orcs are squat, flat-nosed, sallow-skinned, with wide mouths and slant eyes. So there's a particular reason for that, right? And that's because this is, in Tolkien's own words, a fairy tale. And what's a common theme that you see in fairy tales about the bad guys? They're ugly. The bad guys are ugly. You know these are bad because they're ugly, to the extent that, like, there is, like, legitimate racism, not in the book, but, like, addressed in the book, with the with the Druidine later, and again we're going to talk about those later when we talk about the Tolkien Society. But with the Druidine, like these people are considered by the elves and some of the other people until they interact with them and realize these are good people. They're considered to be subhuman because they're ugly. Like it's mentioned that there is racism and it's addressed and saying, "Hey, we were wrong about these people."
And this is to. We're not going to go down this rabbit hole yet.
Hmm.
I think we're going to when we look into our next article.
Uh-huh.
But just to touch on it briefly now, this is the that type of person whose goal in life is to find something like what's something that a lot of people like, and how is it racist, right? I
Uh-huh.
mean, like that's the entire point is to find a thing and then try to point out all the ways in which you dug so deeply and
Hmm.
greatly, haha. Um, but your only goal is to find out what you can say about it that's wrong. Like
Uh-huh.
that you had to reach, like saying like, oh, the Dark Lord in the Dark Land. It's because black is associated with evil.
Yeah, and also, if nothing else, if you go to a landscape, right? Mordor is described as being a black land, like literally black. If you go out to a landscape and it's black, the ground is black, that's black, the first thing you think of is this place is dead. And that's the whole point, right, of the Plains of Gorgor. Is like, look, wow, like because it's meant like you don't see this in Lord of the Rings, but that was at one point there used to be a lake there, and then after the lake was drained, there was life there, and then Sauron came and killed everything. He's so evil that he destroys life. Like that's the point of it. Like it's literally black.
And beyond that, like, how in the world do you assume that that's racist? They're like, well, it's black, and people who don't like black people are racist. That's like an Olympic level leap to get between those two things.
I mean, that is true though. If you like, you don't like black people because they're black, that is racist. I'll give him that.
That's the thing.
Yeah.
But like, you have to literally go from people who don't like black people are racist. People in this book don't like this black land. Therefore, Tolkien, who wrote about them, is racist.
It's like those
Really?
people saying crayons are racist because the black crayon says negro in Spanish.
Yeah, that was a thing for a while. It's incredible. But yeah, I think we're talking too much about something we're about to talk about.
Yeah, I'm mentioning this again though. It says the heroic hobbits and elves are by contrast uber Aryan and ethnically pure. Hobbits are described right, like not so much in the appendices they are, but not so much in the book itself of the Lord of the Rings. They are described very well in the Hobbit. Um, uh, right? But they're mentioned. Um, uh, eh, yeah. Well, I guess so. Here we go. The hobbits are mentioned as being uber Aryan. So Aryan, there are two potential meanings. Um, uh, there are two potential meanings for Aryan. The first is, and I assume that's not what this person means, otherwise it completely destroys his narrative. It refers to persons and language from Indo-Persia, ancient Indo-Persia. I don't think that's what this person is referring to when he says Aryan.
I'm gonna go with no.
Yeah. The other thing it refers to is, quote, Nordicism racism, which is the concurrence of somewhat wavy hair, light eyes, reddish skin, tall stature, and a dolichocephalic skull, which is head that is long and narrow. Okay, so now remember that. Wavy hair, light eyes, reddish skin, tall stature, and hair that is long and narrow. All right, now let's get the description of hobbits from The Hobbit. They are or were a little people, about half our height, and smaller than the bearded dwarves, with thick, warm brown hair like the stuff on their heads, which is curly, have long, clever brown fingers, and good-natured faces. Literally the opposite of the definition of Aryan.
Yeah, because and beyond that, when people are saying like, "Oh, the Aryan and the Aryan," you are immediately thinking of neo-Nazis, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's what people are inferring. They may not come
Yeah,
out and say it, but we all know that's what it means because they know that's what it means.
yeah.
You're talking about Hitler's definition of the Aryan race. We're like, all right, I want these 6'2", blonde-haired, blue-eyed, yada yada yada. No, none of that is even remotely close.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And then referring to the it said like they became the Numenorians became degraded because of breeding with inferior races. There's never a mention that that the other Edain, besides the Dunedain, that they were inferior races. It's implied that people think the Druidine are inferior, but they're not. There's nothing to say that that the other men are inferior. Like there's a very particular reason, right, why the men become less long-lived or shorter-lived. I guess is a better way of saying it. Shorter-lived, not as tall, not as strong, not as cool as they are as they mix with other men. That's because, right, it's the Elros, became a human, but he was an extremely elvish human because he was still half elven, and his descendants were humans that were extremely elvish. And so the more you bring in a man that isn't an elvish man, just a man, the more like a man you'll become and the less like an elf you'll become. Like, yeah, obviously, like, if guess what? If my wife was black, our kid would be less black than her. Because that's what happens. The two things combine, and you become less of both and more of, less of what it was and more of what was brought in. That's how it. I guarantee you, I have a black ancestor at some point. But guess what? I have no black because more and more white was brought in, so I have less and less black. That's
racist. That's that's just plain racist.
That's stupid. And then as soon as I said that, the next sentence, alarm bells ringing yet? Oh, that's funny. I'm not even gonna give the next sentence the satisfaction of reading it.
It's just it gets stupider from here.
Yeah. Yeah. So like, there's a lot of stupidity here. I am gonna mention this. This is the last thing that we're really gonna talk about in this article, and then we're gonna jump to the last and see what he says. I'm not going to read it verbatim, because it's the last three paragraphs are all about one particular thing, and so I'm just going to kind of paraphrase this. It said the U.S. and Israeli far right have tried to use Lord of the Rings to promote their West versus the rest worldview, which is stupid. Because it says, another person said, as Sam and Frodo make their way across the bleak hostile land of Mordor to destroy the Ring of Power, their companions in the West rally a coalition of tribes to wage war against Sauron's minions living among them. So we are fortunate to have these books in the present moment. This is a quote from a decent person. We are fortunate to have these books in the present moment to give us hope and a reason to dig for the long fight ahead. And that was and the person said, it said, the popularity of this reading of the story reminds us of the terrible wrong direction the War on Terror could take, and this shows how old the article is, and one that thankfully has been avoided by the Bush administration thus far. So this was during Bush's presidency. Bush did 9/11.
It do be like that.
Yeah, and so here's what it says. It says, Tolkien presents with an absolute enemy who must simply be destroyed, purely evil and incapable of feeling. It said, but the majority of the people on the other side agreed with us and sought freedom from their dictators. Okay, so here's the point I want to make with that. Yes, but the War on Terror was not against Iraqi civilians, right? A few of them died, and it shouldn't have happened, and, could any of that have been avoided? Maybe. Some of them died accidentally, some of them died in ways that shouldn't have happened. I get that, but here's a problem with that. Those people on the other side who want freedom from the dictators, those weren't our enemy. Our enemies were the terrorists and the ideology of those terrorists, right? And there's something interesting about that. Fighting against terrorism and communism, our enemy is those people who fight for those ideals and those ideals themselves. Because terrorism, fascism, and communism themselves are the enemy. And something about our enemy being terrorism, fascism, and communism, that enemy is purely evil and incapable of feeling. So yes, our enemy in this case is purely evil and incapable of feeling, because our enemy isn't the people who don't like that stuff.
Yeah, that this is where the argument gets even more. They're just trying to be philosophical and trying to be idealistic, and it's failing utterly.
Hmm. And then one more thing before we stop talking about this article. Um, uh, Tolkien himself said that he admitted that he was not a Democrat, as if that were a bad thing. So yeah, I'm not a Democrat, right? I'm hardly on from what you think of as the political spectrum. I'm not. I'm definitely not a Republican. I hate them as much as I hate the Democrats. But like in my belief system, do I believe like what sort of government do I want? A republic is what I would want. So I'm a Republican in that sense, but definitely not a democracy, right? Okay, so here we go. Because if I don't like someone, I'm going to say from the start that I don't like this person. I hate Osho. Also, I want to give a quote from Osho because it perfectly describes what it means to be a Democrat and then believing in a democracy. This is a quote from Osho. Democracy is basically a government by the people, of the people, for the people. But the people are retarded.
Well, to be fair,
Yeah, that's I don't know. So I kind of dominated the communism bit. I guess I should have addressed this in the beginning. I'm the one with 5 pages of notes, and I expected most of what you to say to just be a reaction to my autistic research.
this is true. Also, Osho's there's a very, very long. It's worth mentioning
Mm-hmm.
that particular excerpt came from a pretty long speech that was not exactly Western, shall we say?
Yeah, it's Osho is he was an Indian godman. Is it godman or godman?
I think it's Godman.
Godman, yeah, an Indian godman.
Goldman.
And he anyone who elevates themselves to that position, I can't like. Like not necessarily because people not necessarily because I don't think people should be elevated to the point where they're worshipped as a god or as godlike. He was full of himself, and I didn't like it.
Yeah. Cough, cough the Pope. Moving on.
Yeah. So the very last paragraph here is only 2 sentences. Yes, it might seem absurd to take Tolkien so seriously, but the worlds to which we choose to escape reveal a lot about us. They sure do. So please, when it comes to the big read, vote for Salinger, Tolstoy, Bronte, anyone but Tolkien.
Now, I love that. I love the ending so much because the last little bit is anyone but Tolkien. But I'm going to bring up the 3 people that make me sound like I know what I'm talking about.
Mm-hmm.
Because you could have said, if you were saying anyone but Tolkien, you could have at least made it funny, right?
Mm-hmm.
You could have said, hey, you should read. I don't know. If you're really trying to you're driving this ridiculous point so hard, like read Mein Kampf before you read Tolkien.
Yeah,
right?
I was just about to say vote for the Communist Manifesto before you vote for Lord of the Rings.
See, like, and that would have been funny at least. But it's like,
Yeah.
you should read these people that I read in college.
Yeah. Well, yeah. Here's the thing. Like, if I was going to like try to sound somewhat intellectual, I still wouldn't pick Tolstoy. Like if I was on the left and I would want to sound intellectual, I still wouldn't pick Tolstoy, right? Because you immediately are shown as being pretentious if you say Tolstoy. And so now you've given yourself away. Like, I'd have picked Ernest Hemingway.
Yeah, something that's like
much less pretentious. Still a horrible person, but much less pretentious.
Which, by the way, perfect segue since reading this made me want to blow my brains out.
So, this introductory episode and next episode, which is going to be on the Tolkien Society Summer Seminar of 2021, much more recent, is going to make up our season 0, as it were, before we get into our big topics. So please join us next week as we talk about the thing I just said we're going to talk about.
Yeah, and if you thought that we were racist or bigoted after listening to this one, just wait until the next one.